South Australia is refusing to lift its borders. As of midnight last night, it became more difficult for Victorians on the SA border to cross interstate. Joining me now, President of the Victorian Farmers Federation, David Jochinke. David, thank you so much for joining us, as usual, on Sky News Across Australia. Some good news and some average news there. I mean, the good news, obviously, there are some border restrictions that are being eased, particularly around agriculture, but South Australia is still a sticking point.
Or pressure, or even the fact that people don't have certainty around what's going on in these borders like any other time. It's been really unprecedented, the amount of stress and anxiety that I've heard. But to hear movement on trying to address some of these issues is good, but the fact of the matter remains that we've still got this border impasse that's costing people both money, decimating communities, but even more so that anxiety, that not knowing of when and how these borders will be lifted. Noting too that when you look at the actual number of cases, of COVID cases in these postcodes, in these border communities, are almost zero, but yet they're being treated like a stage 4 restriction, like the metro areas of Melbourne are. And for us, it's all about making sure that we can get that free movement of workforce through these borders, making sure that we have got a comprehensive and bipartisan plan that both states on either side of the line can actually understand and work together to make the borders an operational function, but to keep the goods and services also flowing both intrastate and interstate is the guts of what we in agriculture need to see happen, let alone just the acknowledgement that agriculture is an essential, is a critical service. And for anyone who's a consumer, when you go to the supermarket, you should appreciate this food. It's such a valuable thing, but when we see these restrictions, it does place a stress, it does place a strain through that whole system.
David, you made some very strong comments in the week. You talked about the value of the agriculture industry to Victoria, $40 billion, but you also said we don't just farm for our respective states, we farm for Australia. What did you mean by that?
Well, when you look at agriculture, we are integrated between the whole different systems. So grain farmers need dairy farmers. Dairy farmers need the grain farmers to supply the goods. We need that to go in between each other. But even on a bigger scale than that, we need to be able to move our equipment. We need to be able to move our workforce. We need to be able to move our product. And this is something we look at not in an isolation, not in the small patch where we farm, not in the state we look at. We look at it as a whole nation view of how can we service the nation, how can we produce food that we can get bananas from Queensland down to Victoria, that we can get some dairy products up the east coast to where they're needed, and then even north-south. How can we ensure that that labour force can move around as well? So as farmers, we don't see a border. We just see the opportunity to integrate with the other different environments, the different sectors of agriculture, east, west, north, south. And so when we see a border restriction, it's really an impediment not only to our psyche, but the way agriculture is structured in this nation.
You're saying that South Australia should adopt the same border model as New South Wales?
Well, South Australia is causing huge concerns purely because they're trying to completely limit any movement that may cause risk. But the reality is the risk isn't there. And if we can combine it with a system that does reduce or does ensure that people are doing the right thing so that we do get down to just the critical movements, that's the solution not only for agriculture but also those cross-border communities. And I have to say, I've never had the amount of phone calls in this last week that I have just about concerned people of where can I get my food, where can I get my fuel? I need to just go across the border to get my kids to school. What is the practical solution for these situations? This is above and beyond agriculture. And the frustration is we're looking at it as an us and them, where it should be an us solution. And that's the real issue. It's not an us and them. It is a combined effort. We need to work together.
David, I've been saying this for months now. I think the bush and the regions and agricultural farmers and graziers, we're the big losers in all this. There are decisions being made by city-centric politicians that don't take into effect the implications for those in border communities, and certainly, you look at the seasonal workers and the way in which, the inability of backpackers now to get around this country. You must be incredibly frustrated at the decision-making that's been going on, particularly by city-centric politicians.
I think frustrated would be one of the kindest words you could use to actually describe what the feeling is out there at the moment. It is pure dismay and anguish about these decisions. I'm hearing of people being told to go to Melbourne to fly to Sydney to get to their property over the border. You're sending them to the two hottest corona spots so that they can actually just go to a point where they want to self-isolate on their property to do their jobs. This doesn't make any sense. And when we talk about sense even, we've got to talk about, well, what are we trying to achieve here? Yes, we want to reduce the spread. We want to make sure that we're keeping the movements to only what's needed. But it doesn't mean you've got to shut everything down and treat it like you're in a metro area. So we're just asking that if you're going to make a decision, come and talk to us, understand the ramifications and what that means physically for agriculture, let alone the communities. And the frustration is that people can make these decisions but don't have to live with them. And when we ask the question, who takes responsibility for that crop that's going to have disease or have weeds in it? Who's going to take responsibility for that animal that's not being tended to, that's either lambing or calving? Or potentially, when we get to the warmer conditions, the fly strike season, who takes responsibility for that in agriculture? And quite frankly, there's almost nobody putting their hand up to answer these questions. So that's frustrating us at the level of the representative side, let alone the farmers, let alone those border communities that just really want to have clarity. They want to make sure that they can get on with their job, happy enough to comply with wearing a face mask, just going to point. But when you can't get a permit, when you can't get access to the pure and simple tasks that you need to achieve just to keep the economy going, noting that we're trying to build ourselves to be a $1 billion industry for Australia, not for a state, for Australia, and yet we're being shackled by some pretty draconian measures to try to address an issue that should be more of a common sense, a practical, a risk-based approach, is really frustrating at the least end of the scale of despair.
David Jochinke, always a pleasure to have you on Sky News Across Australia. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, anytime.